Hello, and welcome to our latest episode of the ReNouned podcast. We're your co-hosts, Alison Hager
and Mark Schulz.
And ReNouned is a podcast for the curious. We dust off the commonplace to look for new relevance as we challenge ourselves to think critically about the objects that surround us, how they echo our past, reflect our present, or foreshadow our future. So, Mark, do you want to remind everyone what the noun of this episode is?
Yes, the noun today is alcohol.
Alcohol.
Booze, the juice. No, just alcohol. Yeah.
Should we just jump right in, Mark? And
yeah, let's do it.
Excellent.
Absolutely. Oh.
3.
6.
Wait, this year is your year.
I know. I don't understand it. I'll take it. Although the audience is like, not him starting again. Good heavens. All right.
Forget, folks, you can just skip through Mark and get to me.
Yeah.
I'm kidding. Never skip through Mark.
Well, whenever we remember to
I know.
You can on YouTube when we remember to put in the
the chapters, which is my job, peeps. So that was Mark gently reminding me to which is a fair reminder. But yeah, hopefully for folks, we're going to be putting in chapters. So if you did want to jump around, you could.
Yes, but if you're just listening on any of those, you're just old school, have to fast forward. But
but we know you don't really want to.
Don't skip anybody. Exactly. Come on. All right. So yeah, we'll jump into just the hits. And I am just full out screaming into my microphone today. Well done. Sorry about that, audience. I am ready, Alison. 15 seconds whenever you just let me know.
Okay. And 3, 2, 1, go.
It turns out its very name refers to a blackening. And we'll see today just how truly alcohol can darken the body and the mind.
Wow, you had like 5 seconds left. That was amazing.
Very pithy this time.
Also terrifying.
I know, a little bit.
An evil little laugh. All right. Let me know when you have me set up on the clock.
Absolutely. And go.
Today, we're going to explore the proposition that, quote, humanity is better off and more noble after very nearly 2 drinks than at any other time.
You had 3 seconds left. Excellent. Okay, so I will jump into the rabbit hole this week for my part. So I, of course, started with etymology, and the word alcohol comes from the Arabic word al-kul, which means the powdered antimony. I'm not sure if it's antimony or antimony. Antimony makes me think of alimony, which makes me laugh. But I think it's antimony.
Or abalone.
Right, that's true. So the word was used to refer to a type of eyeliner that was made from antimony sulfide. And it turns out that was poisonous, antimony sulfide. So Arabic women at the time who were using this actually were slowly poisoning themselves over time. So some of them died. I believe Ptolemy and some other ancient sort of medics did end up identifying that it was a cause and a problem. And so it's banned in a lot of places right now. Most of the world actually would have banned it. So the first part of the word al is the Arabic definite article, the equivalent, right, to a the in English. And the second part of the word cool, or kuhl, if I'm pronouncing it right, is derived from the verb kahala, or probably kahala, which means to blacken. So in the 11th century, the Arabic word al-kul was borrowed into Latin with the spelling that we currently have now, alcohol. And this word was used to actually refer to a substance that was distilled from wine and had similar properties to alcohol, this dark liquid. It wasn't until the 16th century that the word alcohol was borrowed actually into English. And for anyone who might hear this and think of kohl, Kohl, which is known as a makeup. So Alison, that might have come to mind for you if we were talking about
alcohol. Yeah, it was an ancient cosmetic, right? Yeah, eyeliner, especially dark eyes is what it's coming to mind.
Yeah, so that is certainly related to that.
Cool.
When it was borrowed into English, it took actually until around 1750s for it to mean the sense of the intoxicating ingredient in a strong liquor, short for alcohol of wine. So it was still focused on wine, but it was really focused on, came in as this dark substance being used during winemaking, et cetera, et cetera. So it wasn't really until 1750s, right, that they really meant the intoxicating ingredient, like the alcohol was what we now know as alcohol. And it therefore was extended to the intoxicating element in fermented liquors overall a bit later. And then I believe in my research, not until the 1800s or so was it used to then, in the scientific realm, actually go from ethanol to isopropyl, like all the other types of alcohols that we now know and can name. It really wasn't the word being used for that until the 1800s or so. So today's episode, I decided to dive into the effects of alcohol on the brain over the long term. And I will be very transparent and straightforward, folks. I actually stopped drinking alcohol about 400 and some odd, basically like almost a year and a half ago. And I actually discovered that a lot of what I'm going to talk about today both frightens me, but also I was feeling some of the effects of over time. So I'm also going to talk about how the brain can bounce back from the effects of this. So it's not all doom and gloom. It's actually quite fascinating in some of the ways that the brain can both be damaged by, but then also bounce back from things like this. So my exploration is really to based on research papers that shed light on this whole process. So I'll look at some patterns, comparisons, and contrasts found in the studies that I looked at, and then we'll learn together about the impact of alcohol on our brain, which is by far our most complex organ. But as always, first let's do a little bit of trivia. And so anyone who hasn't listened before, I like to do this just to sort of mix up and break up my rabbit hole conversation here, my speech, my spiel, and have Alison answer these. But of course, the intent really is for you, listener, to try to listen and answer yourself to see how you do. So the question is, which brain region experiences reduced neurogenesis due to binge alcohol exposure? Is it A, the prefrontal cortex, B, the hippocampus, C, the amygdala, or D, the cerebellum?
Prefrontal cortex.
So the correct answer is actually B, the hippocampus, but the prefrontal cortex is affected. So when I found this trivia question, I kind of thought the same thing. I was like, wait, but it's very involved. So technically, the answer to this question is hippocampus, but we're going to talk about the prefrontal cortex quite a bit. So okay. Well done.
It was in the neighborhood.
Yes, absolutely. So neurogenesis, just a little bit of context on that question, is the process by which creating new neurons from the brain. And it's a critical process for learning, for memory. And binge drinking, unfortunately, has been shown to reduce neurogenesis and overall in the hippocampus, which is specifically the brain region involved in learning and memory. So this reduction can lead to problems related to those two things, right? Anyone, you might think you're just getting older and it's more difficult to remember things, and that can be happening anyway, but you certainly exacerbate that problem when there's a lot of binge alcohol and exposure to the brain, and also learning, the ability to learn and adapt to new things. Anyone who might remember from maybe psychology classes from college or whatnot, you might remember old research from when you learn something when you're under the influence of alcohol, it's then easier to remember it again later if you're drunk. And meanwhile, if you're not, it's a strange sort of relationship between booze and the brain, for sure. Okay, but we'll go into first alcoholism, or actually, as I personally prefer, the clinical term that you'll find in a lot of research papers in the space is alcohol use disorder, so shortened to AUD usually. And it's a significant issue worldwide. I don't think that's a surprise to anyone, but it has a profound impact on individuals, but also the society as a whole. So there's something called the Global Burden of Disease Study, and it's a comprehensive assessment of global health conditions. And it includes alcohol use disorder stats. So it's reported in that disease study, basically, that AUD accounts for approximately what they call 95 million disability adjusted life years, or DALYs, worldwide. So these dollies, which are disability adjusted life years, represent the total years of healthy life lost due to disability or to premature death. So it's not merely a matter of, personal behavior, but also, wide public health concern when you look at numbers like that. Numerous studies have emphasized the importance of understanding the effects of AUD on the brain, right, to address far-reaching consequences like that. So research consistently demonstrates that chronic and excessive alcohol consumption can lead to detrimental changes in the brain structure and its functions, as I've already alluded to in the question, in our trivia question, and so on. So just to go into a bit more detail on those dynamics and what that is. So for instance, a lot of studies have shown that alcohol can disrupt, in particular, a delicate balance of neurotransmitters, such as dopamine and something called gamma aminobutyric acid, or GABA, usually GABA for short. So these alterations in neurotransmitter systems can contribute to the development of addiction and impulsive behaviors associated with alcoholism or alcohol use disorder, AUD. Dopamine in particular, I feel like dopamine has been having a moment probably for the past 5 or 10 years. I feel like it's talked about more in popular culture, memes, social media. I just feel like people are much more aware of it. The fact that Instagram, every time you get a like, people joke like, I need that dopamine hit. Like it's coming much more to popular awareness, the impact of dopamine, even on how apps like Instagram were created and intentionally coded to give you dopamine rushes so that you stay on the app longer, and so et cetera, et cetera. So dopamine is very closely tied to a lot of addictive behaviors and substances, not just alcohol. So dopamine is involved in many important brain functions, including movement, learning, attention, and motivation. And if you're anything like me, you're like, wow, that's just a lot of stuff, right? That one chemical can be responsible for. So I get the feeling like, although we have learned quite a lot about it, we're probably still, skimming the surface on exactly what it is and its consequences. So dopamine is produced in the brain stem. It's released into the synapses, and synapses are gaps between neurons. So dopamine binds to receptors on the receiving neurons, which sends a signal to the neuron. GABA, on the other hand, GABA is the other neurotransmitter that I mentioned, other than dopamine, stands for, as I said, gamma aminobutyric acid, and it's the primary inhibitory transmitter, right? Inhibitory, right? It's stopping or slowing something down of the central nervous system, the CNS system. So that means that GABA helps us to slow down the activity of the neurons in the brain overall. So GABA is also produced in the brainstem and released similarly to dopamine into the synapses, or the gaps between neurons.
And Mark, you're going here, and if you are, just tell me to hold my question. But is GABA then responsible for like how alcohol works as a depressant? Is it because it's inhibiting anything, or it's not related to that? Do you know?
I kind of focused on long term. Do you mean short term influences?
Yeah. I was just thinking like how short term we get this rush, but it's also depressing our neurological system.
Yes, so I would assume that is true, but because I focus only on the long term, I don't know for sure, but I certainly would think so.
Cool, no biggie.
Yes.
I can.
No, I'm actually almost 100% sure, because when you're talking about dopamine and GABA immediately, that's what's going to happen. I was looking at long-term, how it starts to sort of rewire the brain when you do these types of things. But yeah.
Got it.
Okay. I'm just thinking here. So GABA binds to receptors similarly on the receiving end and sends a signal to sort of slow down the activity. So GABA plays a role Also, in an important number of brain functions, it's related to anxiety. GABA actually helps reduce anxiety by slowing down the activity of neurons that are involved in the fear response. So actually, Alison, I think this part of my research does answer probably a lot of your question, why we sort of get that, not just that rush, but you literally calm down in many ways.
Right. Yeah, anxiety that's what I meant.
Like blocked.
Yeah. Interesting.
So for sleep, also GABA helps promote sleep by slowing down the activity of neurons that are involved in wakefulness. Movement as well. It helps to control movement by slowing down activity of neurons that are involved in muscle contraction. So also that's sort of why you sort of loose and limber, the drunker you get. Learning and memory as well. So interesting that both dopamine and GABA are related to this. So it helps to facilitate learning and memory by slowing down the activity of neurons that are involved in those processes as well. So just like a massive break, right, to a lot of processes in the brain. And you can imagine that if you start to mess around with that break, or that break starts to break down itself, that can be problems or cause problems. So other than the neurotransmitters, overall, alcohol has been found to impair the integrity of entire brain regions critical for cognitive functioning overall, right? So studies have demonstrated that long-term use causes these structural changes and damage to the brain, largely including shrinkage of the brain regions, such as the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex. So that's a bit scary. Yes, the brain is a bit neuroplastic, which we'll talk about, but to be actually losing volume and shrinking the brain, that was why my pithy yet dark, just the hits mention, right, that it's not just this blackening of we talked about alcohol and this reference to something that was a dark makeup. Actually, it was sort of mistakenly transferred over into alcohol in our language and the etymology of it all. But also, if you would be looking at brain scans of the brain, you're going to see a lot more dark space because you're actually shrinking the
terrifying
parts of the brain itself. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I'm glad I'm drinking water right now. Straight vodka here.
So the prefrontal cortex, actually, Alison, I suppose your guess for the trivia question. So here we'll get into it a little bit. The PFC, the prefrontal cortex, is a brain region that is responsible for many important functions. So including decision-making, planning, impulse control, social behavior. As I'm listing these off, we're all probably like, oh yeah, last time I was drunk, a lot of these things were affected. Alcohol can damage the PFC in quite a number of ways. And here they are. Direct damage. So alcohol can directly damage neurons, right? Kill the brain cells. We all joke about that probably since we were little, but very true. Killing brain cells and neurons in the PFC, and that damage can lead to problems, as we said, with decision-making, planning, impulse control. Indirect damage. The alcohol can indirectly damage the PFC by disrupting the neurotransmitters, many of them, but we discussed two already. So those neurotransmitters, I mentioned both were produced in the brainstem, but where they sort of go to work and do their thing, it really is in the PFC. So the fact that you're disrupting them means you're also impacting, therefore, indirectly, the PFC's functioning itself. And then the last thing is neuroplasticity. Alcohol can disrupt neuroplasticity, which is the brain's ability to change and adapt over time, or how it changes and adapts over time. You may have heard, and we'll get into a little bit, but you may have heard that things like mindfulness meditation or other types of meditation, even just focusing on the positive, like thinking positively and doing gratefulness journaling, those types of things, which become a very touchy-feely thing. And a lot of people roll their eyes at like, meh. But this is what we're talking about. Your thoughts and your emotions are your brain, right? They're not two separate things. And so when you're looking at the prefrontal cortex and talking about neuroplasticity and how the brain can adapt and basically create new pathways, the more you reinforce certain pathways, the more they're used, the easier they can trigger, the more they're dominant in their influence on your behavior and your social, honestly, your social skills, your memory, your learning, et cetera, et cetera. We'll talk a little bit more about that, I think. So the more alcohol use, the more alcohol affects neuroplasticity, it can really learn to long-term changes that are not as quickly reversed, right? I'm talking about things that you're making patterns in the brain, and the more you reinforce them, it's not like you can just switch them back, right? It's like building a highway. I laugh because we had a whole episode on highway. Everyone, if you missed one of our first episodes, but build a highway. We can't just tear it down and divert traffic immediately to another highway instantaneously. The brain takes some time to do that. All right. So the combination of these impairments, right, that I've talked about so far, not only contribute to sort of the perpetuation of addictive behaviors overall, but it also affects the individual's ability to make rational choices and engage in adaptive social interactions to then fix the problem, to start to change. So we'll talk in my part 2. We have another trivia question coming up. We'll talk a little bit about how that becomes sort of a downward spiral that is hard to disrupt. Okay, trivia 2, everybody, and Alison, my guinea pig. So the question is, which of the following is a type of neural plasticity? A, synaptic pruning. B, long-term potentiation. C, habituation. Or D, all of the above.
All of the above.
Yes, it is all of the above. When I found this question, I was like, oh, Alison's going to totally pull the all of the above card.
If you didn't give me that option, I was going to be like, all of them?
Like, what? Oh, nice. Oh, excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, so just briefly, synaptic pruning, long-term potentiation, and habituation all types of plasticity. So synaptic pruning is the process of pruning, much like pruning a plant, process of removing unused synapses, which allows the brain to become more efficient, and also makes me think that that's why I forget things I haven't used in a long time.
Also,
you ever have that moment where like a basic multiplication from your multiplication table, you're like, oh, wait a second.
I don't want to talk about it. It's so
it's terrifying. Did you have a question, Alison, before I go on? I thought you were going to.
No, I was you were saying, it's like pruning a plant, something you haven't thought of, and you're like, has that really ever happened to you? And I was like, it could have just been aging, because we're all getting older.
Right. Exactly. This plasticity, alcohol not related, is happening on its own. Anyway. Okay. Where was I? Long-term potentiation is the process of strengthening synapses, which allows the brain to store memories. Habituation is the process of decreasing the response to a stimulus that is repeated, which allows the brain to filter out unimportant information. Again, you may think of, I feel like this comes up a lot in movies, but it almost makes me think of the superhero. Oh, it's our standing Marvel reference.
Excellent.
We haven't had one in a while.
I actually have one too, so this is
nice.
Fantastic.
Like, I feel like, I can't think of a superhero that goes through this. There's probably so many of them. I think actually Superman, I think, goes through it. That's not Marvel, but now it's related.
It's DC,
anyway,
so.
But they're all together now, aren't they? But like Spider-Man, others, when they first get like so many senses, they feel overwhelmed, and usually some guru needs to like coach them into how to focus. I think that's basically what this is talking about. Habituation. If our brains were constantly aware of everything all the time, I think we wouldn't be able to handle that. So it filters out things that we become used to, kind of like white noise, a din into the background. So those are just a few types of the many different types of neuroplasticity, and the brain is constantly changing and adapting. And this neuroplasticity is essential for us to, again, connect to these major concepts of learning, memory, and overall adaptation we keep talking about. Okay. So of the three things that we just talked about, right, this direct damage that alcohol can do to the PFC, the indirect damage to the neurotransmitters, and then this damage to neuroplasticity. In my personal opinion, I think the influence on neuroplasticity really is the key to addictions and sort of the downward spiral that can occur and often does occur. So neuroplasticity can reinforce rewards from drugs instead of other activities. So we're thinking, I've been setting up neuroplasticity as this wonderful thing, and it can be, and it's not like it has good or bad nature. It just is. And so I'm going to talk about something that can be detrimental though. So over time, right, if it's linked to our reward system, which is also linked to dopamine and dopamine's effect of giving us pleasure, drugs can cause an unnatural surge of the dopamine in the brain. And that neurotransmitter is so involved in pleasurable feelings of reward that if you have a surge like that, that's unnatural, people can use drugs and alcohol repeatedly, that reward system in the brain becomes so desensitized to the drug itself that there's like these two factors that start to happen. One, which everyone I think is usually familiar with addiction, you need more of the drug to get the same level of high or effect. That is occurring, but it can also lead to people becoming really dependent on the drug itself to feel good, because it's changing the way that the brain learns and remembers. It's changing the reward system. So any of the high that you might get naturally, right? I mentioned a surge. We don't ever have surges like that naturally in our lives before you have a drug unnatural surge or an alcohol effect or something like that. You become sensitized to a surge, not a surge, natural levels that happen from physical touch, interaction, petting a dog, going on a walk, right? Things that we now sort of, again, roll our eyes for being like mindfulness and being aware of. But when you have an unnatural surge, rewire the brain, and the neuroplasticity engine does that. You then go back, you can't feel it. So that can become an engine of, not only do you need more and more of the drug to feel that surge to begin with, but that surge has completely supplanted any natural high. So then when you quit or you stop, it can be very, very difficult to feel anything at all, which makes it incredibly difficult then to sustain long enough to like re-level your dopamine levels and start to feel like, oh, I'm taking a walk and it's sunny and I'm aware of that. And I actually physically feel a high from that. Okay. So yeah, sorry, I jumped around in my notes a little bit, but yeah, that's sort of the more insidious side of it to me. I think we're often more aware of you need more booze to have the same wild effect, or if we're talking about other substances, more of it to have the same high. But I feel like that more insidious, sneaky, and darker side is the fact that it replaces or just so far eclipses natural highs that are not surges of dopamine or feelings, just natural ebbs and flows, that then when you take the substance out or you quit that, it can be very, very hard to go back and reset. Okay. And as we can imagine, that just keeps them in the vicious cycle of, if they quit, they go back to it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there are a number of things that can be done, though, to help people who are struggling with this. And these include some of the classic things you may have heard about. So cognitive behavioral therapy, the type of therapy that really helps people identify and change the thoughts and behaviors that are associated with addiction. So learning new ways and new habits that reinforce things that will change because of neuroplasticity's positive influence, right? Help you build the highways to go back to feeling things and doing things in a different way. Intense mindfulness exercises, new hobbies, support groups, because of not just the ability to force yourself to think through and speak to certain things and experiences, but also to be relearning the social interactions that should give you natural highs and lows of dopamine rather than surges. And of course, medication. I listed this last because a personal preference, but also, you don't want to only rely on the medication. I think because in a way we're talking about substances that are changing the brain in a way. Yes, you may have to use them just to break out of this downward spiral and disrupt. It's almost like a computer trying to boot itself up, right? If it's only can rely on the software and that it has, how is it ever going to start differently? So you might need to actually tinker with it itself, the computer itself, and how it boots, which is how I think about medication sometimes. So there are a number of medications that can reduce cravings or withdrawal symptoms or make this process easier. Okay, so as I start to close here, understanding the effects of alcohol on the brain, I think, is really crucial for individuals struggling with AUD, right? To understand everything I've talked about, I think can do quite a few things. One, it reduces the stigma associated with the disorder and encourages individuals to to be more proactive, to maybe be less nervous to seek out help, treatment, and support, right? If not to blame the body only, but most people blame themselves to such an extent or feel ashamed about it that it can lock them down. If you start to understand the dynamics of what's happening in the brain, I'm not saying it works for everyone, but I think it can help so many to say, oh, there is not only a reason for why it is so difficult. It's not just a personal failing. It's not just like you don't have the willpower, the discipline to do it. Right. You're quite literally programmed to almost not be able to do it yourself.
It's a really important point to make for people, because I know a lot of people just who are struggling with it will just go through that cycle of self-loathing and shame, which it makes it harder, right? Yeah. Harder to get out of.
Yeah. So I think just the awareness of that. And then furthermore, from a broader sort of societal perspective, this knowledge can help us inform and develop targeted preventions and broader intervention strategies, honestly, as well as shape public policies and public opinion, right? We're talking about the person who's struggling with it, but if we can also help others who aren't facing it directly understand more what that person's going through and not to blame them. It's making me think of a TED Talk that I'll try to find, and we'll include it in the notes. But it's about the difference between the US's approach to just say no, the whole drugs and addiction and everything else, and how we treat folks who have addictive disorders to substances versus, I believe it was Denmark, or maybe some Scandinavian countries. I'll find it, but it's definitely a brilliant talk, and things that were actually implemented overseas that are very, very different. They're actually very embracing. They don't judge, and also they don't isolate people. We often isolate those who have addictive problems, and you really to talk about the neuroplasticity and the changes, you actually have to fuse a much tighter social network with people rather than the opposite.
Yeah.
So it's a fascinating TED Talk. I hadn't thought of it before just now. So we'll throw that in the notes for sure. Okay. And apologies. I feel like I'm talking a mile a minute this episode, but hopefully it isn't going too fast. So trivia 3 to round us out here. Question. What was the name of the law that enacted prohibition in the United States? Is it A, the Volstead Act, B, the 18th Amendment, C, the 19th Amendment, or D, the 21st Amendment?
This is embarrassing because I think I did briefly read something on this and now it's gone. And I know that the repeal of prohibition impacted the Constitution. So I want to say it's an amendment, but if I pick an amendment and it's the wrong amendment, I'm going to look even stupider. So I'm just going to have to go with the Volstead Act and then let you educate me.
No, you are correct. It's the Volstead Act. So the Volstead Act, also known as the National Prohibition Act, was the law that enacted prohibition in the United States. It was passed in 1919 and went into effect in 1920. The Volstead Act prohibited the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol. The 18th Amendment was the amendment to the United States Constitution that authorized the passage of the Volstead Act.
Okay, so that's the tricky connection.
Yes. The 19th Amendment, on the other hand, granted women the right to vote. That was thrown in there. But the 21st Amendment repealed prohibition in 1933. So you can think of it as the combination of the 18th meant that the Volstead Act could move forward. Volstead Act actually was the law that banned it. And then the 21st Amendment repealed it.
And what's interesting with the 19th Amendment in between, a lot of the suffragettes came from the Prohibition movement. So a lot of the leaders in, votes for women actually had started kind of making noise and getting involved more with government during Prohibition. So they are kind of connected.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah. Little precursor to part of what I'm thinking about for my big question.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
I love that you just shared that. Okay. That is my rabbit hole for this episode.
That was great, Mark. Thank you. Thank you for sharing all of that.
No, absolutely. I feel like I just like dumped it out there, but hopefully it was coherent.
No, it's great because I think it's such important information. Like, I think that people, of course, to varying degrees, understand, oh, I know alcohol is a depressant, or I know alcohol causes me anxiety, but they don't understand. I didn't understand the actual chemical. And I think it just really helps be thinking about the effects on your brain. Once again, we didn't go down the same path. And I've had a bunch of people randomly and separately ask me recently, like, do you and Mark really not talk beforehand? Do you not know what you're both going to talk about? And, so I'll say it again for new listeners. We do not know. The only communication we might have about it is like, oh, I'm having a rough time with this word, or, oh, I'm loving, but that's it. We never share. And somehow we have not really gone for the same topic yet, which I find pretty remarkable.
It is remarkable, but also I think so good in a way. I think the show stands a lot for dedication to lifelong learning and finding your whatever sparks your interest and your own rabbit hole to follow. So I just feel like it demonstrates, right? Like,
oh, absolutely.
Probably not going to be like anybody else's, and make it your own. And
no, agreed. If we were ever picking the same way, I'd be like, oh, okay, maybe our whole premise for this was a little off. So I love it. Okay, so I'm just gonna, head down to the bottom of the bottle here.
Ooh, so I love
it. The human ability. So I have a little bit about the mechanisms, but not so much the detailed neuroscience that Mark had, which is perfect because I feel like this will give us like a broader view. So the human ability to process alcohol, to actually process it so it doesn't poison us, which it still can do in large quantities, it relies on a set of proteins, including one called ADH4. So all humans have ADH4. And the most ancient form of this protein, of ADH4, is found in primates as far back as 50 million years ago. It only broke down very small amounts of ethanol. And Mark, you mentioned ethanol, and ethanol is basically the intoxicating element of alcohol, and it's used interchangeably. You can say alcohol, you can say ethyl alcohol, or you can say ethanol, and it kind of all means the same thing. It only broke down the very small amounts very slowly. But then about 10 million years ago.
Wait, so that means 50 million years ago, those apes, if they got drunk, were like drunk for a long time. Is that what you're saying?
Or I don't know if they were drunk for a long time, or they would just get very sick.
Or like die, probably can't even process. It's probably like giving a dog chocolate or something. It just can't.
Right. Go through it. And so they would have avoided it. But then about 10 million years ago, the common ancestor of humans, chimps, and gorillas. So about 10 million years ago, we branched out. The last fossil, or the based on the fossil evidence we currently have, the last common ancestor between humans, chimps, and gorillas was around 10 million years ago. By then, this common ancestor had evolved a version of ADH4 that was about 40 times more efficient than the original version. Also,
just so I'm tracking, ADH4 meaning it could break down ethyl alcohol.
Exactly. Yep. It can process it in the body, so it's not poisoning you. At about that same time, 10 million years ago, ape populations were crashing because of food competition from different monkey species. So monkeys could and can eat and digest unripe fruit, which is a problem for humans and apes.
They probably weren't piling them up yet. They were piling those fruits together.
I will always, always love a pile reference. Piles of fruits.
Piles of things. Sorry, go ahead.
So you had that happening because these monkey species populations were rapidly increasing. And a third thing happening at the same time, the common ancestor I mentioned started exploring the ground more. So instead of being primarily tree dwelling, had started to expand and be down on the ground. Why are you giggling? I'm just waiting for you to say.
I'm just laughing because I remember you laughing at me being like, when we were in the trees.
Oh, right.
Anyone totally confused, listeners, if you listen to, oh my God, Alison, which episode was that?
I think it was the second
construction.
Episode.
I think it was, yes, construction, our second episode. We talked a lot about that period of the sort of pre-humanoid primate, and our movement from trees to land and being able to stack things and create piles. And I'll shut up. But thank you, Alison. So as we started to explore the ground level, you said.
Exactly. So this is starting to happen. This common ancestor's doing that. And it was probably, it was definitely fruit eating, kind of slow climbing. I think based on the fossil evidence, it resembled a baby gibbon. Very cute. I'll post an image. But now being on the ground more meant eating fruit that had fallen out of trees. So fruit on the ground is
fermentation.
You got it. Sorry. You got it. So there are scientists who argue that ADH4 was evolutionarily selected for because fermenting fruit, first of all, it has higher calories once it's fermented. So that is good for survival. So you're getting more food because now you're on the ground. So you have access to the fruit in the trees and the fruit in the ground, and you're getting a higher calorie food if we're eating this fermenting fruit, and you can process the ethanol. So evolution says, yes, this is good. They're going to survive longer by having this ability to process the alcohol.
There's a cartoon in there somewhere with like the gibbons in the tree eating their salad of leaves that are not fermented, and the drunk gibbons on the ground being like, this is better in the long run. Anyway,
I'm waiting for you to draw that. So
I will. I may.
Get to work. So this evolutionary history may be why the human brain links pleasure to alcohol. As we know, a lot of times with evolutionary biology, we can link back to these things. So the theorized early benefits were, of course, what we talked about, like source of energy. You're getting more calories, more energy. Of course, there were psychotropic effects. There were likely medical benefits. There's certainly throughout our history, there are a lot of examples of the medical benefits of drinking alcohol when the water quality wasn't high enough to drink. So you get something that's antibacterial and antiparasitic. And of course, there were social benefits. So apes and chimps and humans, and presumably that common ancestor are extremely reliant on a tight social structure for survival. And one of the effects of alcohol is kind of creating those bonds, right? Letting down inhibitions a little bit. So those are the theories the scientists have of like why there are all these benefits. So alcohol was probably a good guy in our evolution for all these reasons. But then after millions of years of, evolution selecting for this ADH4, we have now countless examples throughout history of alcoholism being a problem, not a benefit. Alcohol is the most commonly abused substance in the world. It's the third most common cause of death in the United States. It's often not even, it is considered technically a drug, but a lot of people don't even think about it as a drug because it's so normalized in so many cultures, including ours. But in fact, alcohol withdrawal is more dangerous than heroin withdrawal. So with heroin withdrawal, you might feel like you want to die, but the withdrawal itself isn't going to kill you. It's very similar to something you mentioned, Mark, when you were just talking about when your brain gets used to a high. I took a course in college on addiction, and the professor was they brought someone in who was a former heroin addict who was now a therapist and a counselor. And the way he described it will always stick with me. He said, once you do heroin, when you come back to normal, normal feels like hell. Heroin feels so good that doing it once has put you in this euphoric state that like other things, sure, they do that, but not to that level.
I've heard the same thing about crystal meth. It's so freeing and such a surge of positivity, but it but it instantly then it wrecks you because one time and then you can't stand to be sober because it feels like hell. But alcohol withdrawal, more dangerous. So alcohol is a depressant, which we talked about a little bit. And as the body withdraws, right, as it's starting, the alcohol is starting to dissipate, the whole nervous system snaps. So Mark talked a lot about these neurological effects. So the whole nervous system like almost snaps back into its previous state, often manifested as anxiety. So if you were using alcohol to calm yourself and calm anxiety and have that depressant effect, now you've snapped back and all your neurons are firing at this highly excited state. And a lot of people who've had a hangover will relate to this, like the next day feeling anxious and that sort of thing. That is because your entire nervous system is now like, I'm sure it's the disruption of the GABA neurotransmitter. Yeah, that we were talking about. It's not slowing down and
So you've got, this anxiety and this hypervigilance, and then of course, headaches and cravings and tremors. None of those things are going to kill you. But with more severe alcohol withdrawal, the symptoms can progress to hallucinations, seizures, what we kind of commonly call delirium tremens, DT, the DTs. And this is where it gets dangerous and life-threatening. And that's why it's so important for AUD, you said, right? I was going to say people with advanced alcoholism, but people dealing with AUD at an advanced state really need to withdraw in a treatment center. So you get all the same symptoms you get that I mentioned previously, just from maybe a bad night out drinking, but you start to get, the things like I mentioned, seizures, but your blood pressure can skyrocket, your body temperature can skyrocket. You can start having heart arrhythmias, your muscles start breaking down, you can have aspiration pneumonia. So suddenly your life is actually in danger because your system is so thrown off and it's not getting the alcohol anymore, and your nervous system cannot rebalance. DT also has a really high likelihood of igniting other comorbid conditions. So you can have massive changes in your electrolytes or your heart rate or your blood sugar. So if you already have diabetes, it's going to be a major issue. If you already have cardiovascular disease, withdrawal can kill you in very short order. So which
again is something that I think people joke like, oh, I'll just take some Pedialyte the next day, I'll bounce back, it'll be fine. Yes, while that may help, the effect of the electrolytes is so important. It's no joking matter and really critical.
Yeah.
I'm glad you brought that up.
On your entire system. So I just thought it was such an important fact because, again, we might have this sense of alcohol is not a real drug, or, because it is so normalized, it can have really, really, really massive effects. So it's far from benign, but you take us down a different path now.
Oh, well, before you're probably going to go, cut me off if I'm stealing some thunder here. The level of cancer risk that's coming to light just in the past year in research actually is really substantial. It's often now held up, I believe, as either comparable or worse than smoking. It's really wild, even in fairly low concentrations or usage. It's not the cardioprotective thing that had come to light, in some one-off papers a bit ago. There's no cardiovascular protection and the cancer risks are huge. Yeah.
Anyway. I'm really glad you brought that up. No, because I wasn't going to bring that up, but actually a good friend of mine who's a nurse, unrelated to this, and we hadn't even gotten this word yet, I don't think, this noun, she shared that with me, that she had been seeing more and more studies that what you said, cancer and cardiovascular issues, more so in women, actually, but both. I mean, men are not safe from this at all. But what you said, smoking's still really bad. Also, alcohol might be as bad, just really, really terrifying. And one of the things I thought I would do, I'll just do a little aside here when we got alcohol as our noun, was talk about, what you just mentioned, Mark. There are older studies that came out, what was it, a decade ago, 20 years ago, that said, hey, 2 glasses of red wine.
Right, the red wine.
It's good for you. It's good for your heart. And then now there are so many studies that contradict that. Now, nothing is definitive. This was interesting to me. Like scientists are actually still fighting. And that is why I didn't go down this route, because I think it's such an important topic. And because even the top scientists can't agree and they're debating your experiment wasn't controlled enough and all those things. I am not a healthcare, right? I did not want to risk giving any wrong information in either direction. So I thought there's enough out there.
No, that's fair and a good thing to say. So folks, if you're hearing, the latest that I've heard is that several studies came to light that there is no protective, enough that they would feel very comfortable saying it's overturned. But to Alison's point, it's not like we have 100 years of research in this area. It's still relatively new. So, look into it yourself for sure, but just don't fall for only thinking, oh, red wine's healthy for me.
Exactly. Or a couple drinks, it's fine. True. Like Mark said, they're really seeing small amounts of alcohol. So there's no,
and remember how many established institutions would be affected if that were to be true.
Exactly. I'm going to talk about that a little bit, a little bit. So I'm glad you brought that up. So I'm not saying don't believe these new studies at all. I'm saying for me to talk about it for 25 minutes,
Totally.
I couldn't do it justice, and I would be very afraid that I would be spreading misinformation one way or the other. Okay, so now I'm going to take a little turn here because now that I've been a little down and terrifying people about what can happen to you and how humanity went from like this great evolutionary thing to lots of horrible stuff. But there is a theory out there. It's a real theory that a moderate amount of alcohol is actually beneficial. And I don't mean in the way that Mark and I were just talking about. I don't mean in, it might be good for your heart or it's fine. I mean for your cognitive functions. We're going to talk about this a little bit. I came across this in the silliest of ways. So as I was deciding which direction to go with the noun alcohol, I remembered, and Mark, you may remember this. I remembered this British comedy sketch I saw years and years ago.
Yes, I know exactly where you're going. I can see it hidden in the coat. Oh, sorry, go on.
The premise was that everything runs more smoothly in the world if everyone is always just nearly 2 drinks in. And the quote that I used in my quick hit was from this sketch. It's from a British show called That Mitchell and Webb Look, and it was probably from around. It was somewhere between 2006 and 2009. I'll link the video. It is very witty. So it's very funny. It's really fun. So that was in my head, this old video that I probably saw, 15 years ago. So I was looking for that because I just knew I wanted to at least mention it and post it. And I came across something called the Balmer Peak, Ballmer. Have you heard of this, Mark? I had not.
No, but I think I know where you're going in terms of like GABA and dopamine at a certain immediate peak level. But this
is a real theory, and it holds that imbibing alcohol can improve cognitive ability up to a point. So let's be very clear here. I would also like to I'm sharing this with you because I find it very interesting. I am not at all advocating.
Yeah. It sounds like it's also going to be short term and not like the long term effects.
Exactly. So this whole theory, the Balmer Peak, actually named after Microsoft Steve Ballmer. We'll talk a little bit more about why that is and why in the tech world. All right. But it's loosely based off of something called the Yerkes-Dodson law, which was proposed in the 50s by 2 psychologists. And basically the Yerkes-Dodson law, they weren't looking at alcohol or intoxicants at all. What they were looking at is for problem solving, simple problem solving and then complex problem solving. What is the optimal state of arousal? They did not mean sexually. They did not mean, right? But like just what is the optimum state of like how you're stimulating your system. And of course, it's a bell curve and there's like this kind of sweet spot right in the middle. And so in the tech world, forever, there has been anecdotal evidence suggesting that optimal programming, so coders, that like optimal coding occurs when people are about 2 beers in. So to me, this just sounds like a very tech bro, legend. But somebody put it to the scientific test back in 2012. So the University of Illinois tested the creative problem-solving ability of a group of men. They were given vodka cranberry. I don't know why that makes me laugh. I just think that makes so, me laugh, right? Yes. Right? Like, why weren't they just given beers or a glass of wine? I don't know. Why was it a cocktail, which is much more involved? So they're giving, vodka soda with a whisper of crayon. And
maybe it's easier to control the exact amount of vodka than you're putting in there. If you don't trust like a beer's canning process has variability.
Okay, that's fair. And beers can have different alcohol and wines can that actually makes
maybe
sense.
I'm making that up, but it sounds feasible.
Anyway, they're given vodka crayons and some snacks, and they were asked to solve brain teasers. And the results were starkly different between the groups. So the tipsy group, the drinking group, had a blood alcohol concentration level of about 0.075 versus the control group who weren't drinking. Those in the drinking group averaged 9 correct questions to the 6 in the non-drinking group. It also took the tipsy men 11.5 seconds to answer a question, whereas the non-drunk men needed 15.2 seconds to think. And both groups had comparable results on a similar exam beforehand. So they did control for that. So you can't argue, one group's just smarter or one group, is better at this sort of thing. So Mark, you mentioned a little bit about memory. They did note it's not great for working memory, meaning short-term memory at all, but it is great for problem solving in this very narrow range. So I don't know about you, but it actually does almost intuitively make sense to me. So for instance, like I like to play pool. I'm not particularly good at it, but I enjoy playing pool. I'm never better at it than when I've had like 2 beers. So
I hear you.
yeah,
I used to be the
straight
same.
sober, I'm not very good at all. If I had any more than 2 drinks, definitely less capable. There's this sweet spot. And I always just thought it was I don't know, funny coincidence, but actually this ridiculous premise does ring somewhat true to me. And now we have scientific evidence. So then so I just think it's very funny. And I saw this comedy sketch about like everyone should just be just under 2 drinks in all the time for like a better world. And then I found out about this real law. And then going down this rabbit hole, I came across a 2020 film called Another Round. Have you heard of that, Mark? It's a Danish film. It's a Danish film starring Mads Mikkelsen. And this is our Marvel reference. Mads played a character in Doctor Strange. So he played Caecilius, who was the kind of disillusioned sorcerer.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, he's a fantastic actor. So it's a Danish film, and it's about a group of middle-aged men putting something similar to the Balmer Peak to the test. It got really great reviews. I didn't read the full reviews. Mark knows I don't want to know too much. I just want to know enough to think like, do I want to watch this? But I did decide to watch it in the name of research, and because Mads is a fantastic actor. But I was really leery about the focus being on a bunch of white, middle-class, middle-aged men struggling with their midlife crises, right? I mean, that is the premise, like why they decide to go down this road of testing this, maybe be a little bit drunk all the time. But I tried hard to muster up my compassion for all beings, including white, middle-aged, middle-class men. And I watched it. Highly recommend it. Highly recommend it. It was not some comedy romp or some celebration of alcohol. It was really tenderly done. Sometimes comically, maybe because it's a Danish film and not American, right? Maybe the handling of it was a lot more gentle. I don't know, but it was actually really lovely. So that is where I'm ending it. I just wanted to share why we probably like alcohol. Then it all turns very bad and can kill us. But there's this interesting little side note that a couple of drinks might help you just be a little bit better at cognitive problem solving. In my opinion, again, lots of research out there based on some of the stuff Mark and I were talking about, not worth it for the cancer risks and all the other things that they're starting to see now. But right. Interesting, just side note that there may be some benefits that our brains still kind of connect to, and another reason we crave it.
And yeah, and if you don't mind, I know usually we wait to the big questions. I'd love to react to that because I fully agree with you in terms of I have experienced that phenomenon and I absolutely think it occurs. Where my brain goes, where my mind goes here is when I'm thinking about this effect of the 2 drinks, I do think that it is turning off the self-talk that might be holding us back from something, levels of doubt that would normally keep us from reacting instinctively to something or instinctually. You know what I mean? So I can absolutely see where it would clear some brush of our thought patterns in some ways, in order to have us be a little bit, uninhibited. I think that's why it is easier to speak if you have somebody, if you are someone who has a bit of social anxiety or a lot of it. Booze is certainly the social lubricant everybody thinks it is for certain reasons, but yes, only to a point. Where I want to put that in context is I feel like and I do get into this a little bit with my big question. So maybe this.
Well, why don't you just jump in? Because I'm done. I wrapped up my rabbit hole. So it's perfect timing.
That's perfect timing. Yeah. And to keep us sort of on time. But I think in broader context, there's problems for why we're not learning to do those things, to be better on problem solving and tests without alcohol, because we have things that are locking us up socially. There's fear involved, I think, in our normal day-to-day that shouldn't necessarily be there. Is where I'm going to kind of go. Anyway,
Yeah. Okay.
does that make sense? Like
It completely makes sense.
I think what they're
Yeah.
measuring makes sense and absolutely happened. I just wish that it didn't, that the baseline didn't have to be so inhibited to begin with in our normal day to day.
Yeah.
Okay. So big questions, everybody. If you're unfamiliar with our show, this is where we kind of try to take where we've gone with our research and our thinking about it and take one more step up, go macro with it, go a 30,000 foot view and think big questions that may or may not have almost ever have answers that are either possible or easy. But for me and my third trivia question sort of teased it up. Here's where I went. Slightly provocative, maybe not quite a hot take, but it's interesting to me. So prohibition is held up, I think, as a massive mistake in American history. At least that's how the vibe I've gotten as growing up in this day and age. That the passage of it and denying the masses this quote unquote opiate, it's not an opiate, but actually technically, if you think about brain chemistry, I didn't go down this rabbit hole. There's a lot of reaction to alcohol and its byproducts and how the brain reacts to it that is opiate-like. But anyway, that's a side note. But when we denied this, right, I think what we think about is the 20s, it fueled massive gang and organized crime activity.
In fact, it was the beginning of organized crime, because before that, organized crime was on a much smaller level. But now the amount, sorry.
That's perfect. But yeah,
I was reading a lot about prohibition because I thought that might be a route I went down with this noun. But when we think about Capone and others, it was for the first time, it was so much money involved in this that they really started killing each other left and right. And they needed to run it like a business because there was so much money and so many logistics involved, from the manufacturer to the transport, right? To the, so basically. Organized crime did not exist before prohibition, which is really interesting. Sorry, continue.
That's absolutely perfect, because I'm sure that fueled a bit of the repeal in the 33 for sure. I think it's partly why we're repealing, and changing our views on marijuana now, et cetera, et cetera. Very different in how it's culturally, racially been influenced and so on. So I'm not saying it's identical, but I think there are some similarities in how we are legally changing our views on things like marijuana and alcohol at the time. Anyway, so also, if we put aside what I think would be sort of the puritanical extreme implementation of prohibition as well, I kind of wonder if there was, at its core in prohibition, the movement to ban it, a bit of a spark of truth and a bit of a spark of need. Like if you take into effect everything that Alison and I have been talking about and its ill effects, both on the individual, but on society, et cetera, et cetera. Again, I think we look back at prohibition and be like, oh, is this puritanical, religious, different? It was too extreme. It didn't work. It started to fuel crime, everything else. Yes, that is true. But was it not perhaps necessary? And was there not a spark of need? And is there not potentially still a spark of need? Now, I'm not saying to prohibit it, to go as extreme as it was, but with so much violent crime, abuse, cancer, heart disease, everything we've talked about, and many other massive health, financial, social burdens that are all so directly linked to alcohol. Especially in our society, I'm looking at my note here, and it's sort of heartbreaking. In a society that is also less and less rewarded through social connection, we are more and more isolated. There's massive epidemics of loneliness that we see so much in the news recently, and a lack of social intimacy. Is alcohol really a faulted coping strategy being used to mask this problem of a disconnection in society? And so if people are turning to it more and more now and having all of these negative health and social aspects, is there almost more of a need now to re-envision a different sort of social contract with alcohol in the country than there even was in 1918? right? I think it's worse now to probably look at it. So here's my big question. Should the use of or the sale of alcohol be much more tightly regulated than it is? I'm not saying ban it outright like it was. I don't know that that's going to work, but should individuals be licensed to drink? For example, I know that's going to freak people out, but should you be licensed? You're licensed to carry a firearm. You're licensed to do XYZ.
I mean, theoretically.
Theoretically. Exactly. Should you have periodic checkups to maintain a license to use a substance like alcohol? Or as the evidence continues to mount up about its cancerous effects, will it maybe be banned again in the near future, more specifically for health? For example, we banned smoking in public places. Now, that was largely due to secondhand smoke and the fact that if you chose to drink, you're affecting other people. But at what point, potentially in the near future, will we say that it's too dangerous and potentially ban it? I know, big provocative questions. I'm not saying you should, but
I think it's great. And I'm actually going to answer you a little bit with my big question, because wow, did we really come to the same big question on this one? So here's my big question as I wrote it. The alcohol lobby, not to mention Big Pharma, and Mark, you kind of grazed on this earlier, has worked for years against the legalization of marijuana, a drug that arguably has fewer severe neurological and physiological impacts on the body.
Right.
So should we as a society be more focused on legalizing drugs, but providing better education about them? And then you mentioned this TED Talk. I jotted this down, so maybe the answer is in there. Or banning drugs and controlling alcohol in a more systematic way, thus potentially driving up demand and creating our current state for cocaine, heroin, and meth, which is a violent crime industry. So we asked basically the same exact question. So I honestly,
that is the first time we've landed on the same big question.
On the same question. And I think that the tricky thing about banning it, not that it would ever be easy, but a friend was just telling me recently that she was reading something somewhere. She saw a documentary or something. So when the drunk driving laws in the States came about in the 80s, she was watching old news interviews with people who were like, I work hard all day. All I want to do is have a few beers.
So interesting. I feel like I saw this recently. I think it's making the rounds on social media.
It must be, because she had just seen it recently. And she said it was mind-blowing. Mind-blowing. No one would even consider saying that now, but at the time, they're taking away my rights. Like, all I want is to go have a few beers with my friends. I work hard. People were like horrified. So even a small prohibition on a behavior related to alcohol, now it's pretty, it's enforced now. Like it did go through, but I think doing a broader thing like licensing would have this country in an uproar. But as usual, I don't have an answer on whether I think it's a good idea. I do think it's a good idea to some degree, because I think I personally feel like alcohol is a more dangerous drug than marijuana is in terms of how it affects our brains. Now there's a lot more research to be done, I think, out there, but how it affects our brains, how people often react more violently to alcohol, are more likely to kill others than if they're using marijuana. Marijuana seems to have a lot more medical benefits associated with it. So we regulate that pretty highly, which obviously is changing in a lot of states. And we don't regulate alcohol at all, to your point, Mark. So I do think actually people are going to be really angry about this, be a good thing. To some degree. And
I can add a personal, I don't mind sharing, right? I shared that I stopped drinking about a year and a half ago. I had also quit drinking for about a year, 9 years ago. I think I would have reacted negatively and thought it was, hold on, let me rephrase that. If I think about it now, I know that a lot of people would react negatively if we were talking about licensing and some sort of compulsory education on it before you were allowed. Like to go really get educated and pass a test before you were licensed to drink. We think that's probably completely bizarre right now. If that was true for me personally, who knows? It's an alternate universe where I might have rolled my eyes and just gone through it like taking a driving test. But had I learned the impact, I never really understood why it was so freeing for me as an 18-year-old. Why it was so freeing from anxiety and why it was like the best thing. Had I had to be licensed to understand and have potentially follow-ups, I think I would have gotten way out in front of it before it became a problem for me.
Mm.
You know what I mean? Like that would be huge. So although again, we don't like the idea of licensing and people freak out in this country about big government and everything else, that would be very important. It would have been important to my life. And I think to everything you just said, societally, it would be huge. But I did write here, which I feel like we often come to this root, I think, in a lot of our big questions, actually. I have here, it all boils down to individual versus community, right? How do we keep the individual free to make their own choices and pursue their own desires while balancing the impact on others and helping that individual when they might lose the agency of self to understand what is best for them? That is the biggest triggering thing, is when you think or take over the agency from someone else. And I am almost never advocating for it, because I'm not conservative in so many ways, but if there is a streak of libertarian or something in me, it is that. It is do not force me to think about something a certain way. That's never going to happen. But this might be a case where, because it is a downward spiral, because it literally changes how you think about it, do we have to? I'm talking a lot, but do you agree that it boils down to that balance of the social liberty versus what are the effects 100%, on others?
Which again, it's like no answer. You're always going to have people arguing on both sides. You're going to have libertarians arguing one way, and then, going to have. Right.
Well, that's part of it, but that in itself is maybe part of the answer. That's why I feel like it can never be black and white. I feel like the right is always about completely black and white thinking and saying that no matter what, you should never ban the or limit the individual's freedom to do or say almost anything. That is absolutely ridiculous, because we do it all the time.
Exactly.
To have society function.
And also that argument that people use, don't take away my right to drink. Like I get to choose, like I can know the effects, which most people don't, and I can still choose it. Well, then you can't then protest legalization of marijuana. Right. So you're saying, well, right. I think that marijuana has like worse effects on the community, so I'm going to say that's bad, and alcohol's not. And then you look at the data and say it's actually not true. Alcohol has worse effects on community and society, but people are not going to think that way. They're just going to say, "Don't touch my booze."
Exactly, and forget that we live in a police state where everything is controlled. But yeah. Yes, but meanwhile, we become more and more disconnected. I feel like another thread, right? What I was talking about before is, why would somebody do better on a test after 2 drinks? Well, we're assuming that this was quote unquote a normal, ideal society that test was being taken in. And I would argue that no, right now, at least in most cultures, but certainly in American culture, there is so much repression and fear and bizarre social influences on your sense of self and expression and connection with other people, that the more that we rely on alcohol to literally free ourselves from that. No wonder why we do well and feel amazing for the first 2 drinks. Wouldn't it be nice if we were able to do that without it? Right. To learn how to do that without it. And also, to tie it back to the 19th Amendment, I love that you shared that a lot of them, the suffragettes, came from the prohibition movement, because for a moment I was going to say, and again, this is this odd balance of personal experience, but also when I look around, imagine how much more mobilized and engaged the American populace would be if booze just didn't exist for right now. Let's just say, had it been banned or whatever, or just never caught on, that people were much more about social interaction and caring about what was happening rather than tuning out and escapism versus being able to cope with the stress of actually facing problems. I don't think it's a surprise that you had suffragettes, therefore, active and engaged and organized to push something through like the 19th Amendment when alcohol wasn't there to literally rob millions of people of every weekend or every day.
No, I think that is interesting. Yeah, to tie that in. I also think just to play devil's advocate, we cannot assume that every single person who's drinking to excess is doing it to tamp down their anxiety but I mean, they probably are, to be clear, but I just kind of just wanted to throw out there, like,
there are maybe
different reasons people are drinking.
Yeah. But also, even if they're not doing that intentionally, would we agree that
the result?
The hangover and what's happening would be straying from being, I just feel like it macroly, is that a word? You're looking across like the big picture. We talk about civics being in the toilet in this country, like in terms of our awareness. And I'm not saying I'm not guilty of this myself, but an involvement in everything from local government to major government to voting to all of it. I think we are a bit dysfunctional in the ability to cope with how bad things are and facing problems. And we're coping through substance and escapism and movies, sports, and booze.
No, I think that's.
I'm not saying we should. I know that sounds like I am absolutely strapping on my Puritan boots, but I'm just saying that is a dynamic I think we should keep an eye on because.
Yeah, no, I agree. And maybe more research coming out of the alcohol space because it seems like a lot more is being done in that space right now.
Yeah. And things are actually very much changing, even in just the past few years. There's many more alcohol-free bars, like just so that you're focusing on the social interaction and so on. Far less people are drinking in younger generations now than they have in the past.
Yeah, which is fantastic.
It's wild. It's pretty wild.
Well, okay. I have one more big question. It's very quick, and it's more silly because I always
goodness.
You really are turning into a Puritan.
I know.
I like to always throw in a bit of a silly one, so this will be very quick. But the movie I watched, Another Round, made me think of this because there are 4 men in it who, for much of the movie, need to act some degree of inebriated. From tipsy to very drunk. And you once told me, Mark, from your acting days, yes. I'll never forget this because I was fascinated by it. I think we might have mentioned this in a previous episode even, that it's very hard to act drunk. Like, so you think that, I'm acting on stage. Of course I know how to be a drunk. I'm going to stumble around. I'm going to slur my words, like everything. And you were saying when you're sober, it is actually very hard to do that. So I thought you might appreciate this movie, watching it just for that, like for that level of performance. And I wanted to ask you, do you still think it's harder for a sober person to act drunk than a drunk to act sober?
Oh, gosh, that's a really good question. It's so balanced. And what's interesting about the question is that the key I have found in my training anyway, the key to acting drunk when you're sober is actually to latch into that fear of how you are perceived as being drunk when you're drunk. So you're trying to act preoccupied with being very, very precise so that you're not coming across drunk. Does that make sense? You are focusing yourself as an actor to really stare, but miss a spot that you damn well better just fucking find. You know what I mean? Like, so if you find actors that are like often like all over the place like this, that can become putting it on. But if you find one that's really good, they're trying to track a spot, but they just can't quite. So, or they really want to walk in a straight line, but they're finding a way not to be able to do it. But the focus is to not appear drunk. You're playing like, don't come off.
Right. So you're actually trying to be precise with just being slightly off of it. I really am going to need you to watch this movie because I need you to like rate these performances.
No, absolutely.
Which I think are excellent.
Just completely expound on that. But yeah, that was one of my fun things and growing up and going to acting school or getting a degree in it. Actually, that was a fun thing to learn and a way to turn the tables on exactly what you're saying, that dynamic of, you actually don't approach it nearly the same way. You're not trying to play drunk. You're actually trying to appear sober, but finding physical ways to make that very hard to do.
Right. I love it. Okay. Well, cool. In the interest of time, why don't we go back to our ratings, Mark? So
yes,
you had rated alcohol as an 8.
I'm going to stick with an 8.
All right. I had rated alcohol as a 7. I'm actually going down. I'm going down to like a 4.
Wow.
And just let me tell you why. I found it very difficult, which I thought would be such a rich topic. And I think we're starting to see a theme with those things we think are going to be rich. I didn't, as I mentioned, I didn't want to talk about the research on like, is some amount beneficial or
Right.
not, because that research right now is so contradictory, and I do not want to be giving, any sort of wrong advice. And I thought I talk about prohibition or the development of organized crime, but it didn't seem to be enough there. That was really an interesting story. Right? So I found all these threads didn't lead me anywhere, which just could have been whatever. It could have been I was having a hard time with the research. It's not the word itself, but it wasn't as rich as I thought it was going to be. So I'm going down to a 4.
All right.
And now you get to give us our next noun. Do you want to tell your very exciting news?
I will tell the very exciting news. So everyone, we now have our very own noun generator, random noun generator. And I'm gonna take a little bit of credit here and say that it's actually better than the one we were using. So if you go to renownedpodcast.com and ever want to try it out, do this yourself, maybe go down your own rabbit hole with a new noun. Yes, renownedpodcast.com. You'll see up in our main navigation menu that there is a new page called Noun Generator. And you know what? Since we're dedicated to lifelong learning and geeking out, as we joke about all the time, I had a blast actually figuring out how to code and source the nouns for this and everything else. And actually the noun list is really, really profoundly like dense, upwards of 80,000 or more. And it comes from a open source Princeton WordNet, which is not just nouns, but I've siphoned the nouns. And so in some ways, because Princeton's collection of the English language is one of the largest, if not the largest, that's ever been amassed in history, you could argue that I'm not saying that ours is unique. There may be another one that has used the nouns, but this collection of nouns that our generator's drawing from is probably one of the largest ever put together in the history of humanity, which I think is super cool. We did not create it. We did not do that, right? But leveraging Princeton's WordNet, really fun. Anyway, so I am going to actually use our own website to create and generate our next random noun. So hold your breath, everybody. Here we go. In 3, 2, 1. Now, here's the cool thing.
Okay.
This noun generator was not limited to single words, which our last one was. So now we get the interesting thing of actually having things that might have multiple words.
Okay.
So our random noun, Alison, is the American harvest mouse. I love this. What a change for us. It's not like this big concept.
I am sorry. I'm loving this so much. I'm sorry, people. Now I'm laughing. I'm tearing up because that is like so amazingly specific, and I am in love with it. And I do like that now we have broader options for what we might be talking about. I hope we're still excluding gerunds, however.
I wasn't able to. I don't think they're included, but we're going to have to find out if they pop up one day. Okay.
The American harvest mouse. I mean, just based on the novelty of this, I have to go with an 8. I'm 8 all the way.
Yeah, I'm an 8. Let's do it. Let's 8 it up. Oh, we ate it up. God, it's terrible. And I said it. But I'm so excited by this, right? Because part of our whole mission statement for this podcast is to dust off like what might be just laughably mundane. And here we go. This is one.
I love it. And Mark, huge kudos to you, everyone. Mark keeps saying we, but Mark did this entire thing and built this entire thing. And he is the tech genius in this duo of him and me. So yay, thank you. And I hope that people will also be able to have some fun with the word generator as well.
Yes.
So with all that, right. Mark, do you want to read us out?
That is the end of another episode, everyone. We really do hope you enjoyed our conversation and learned something. We are, as we said, dedicated to finding and carving out time for lifelong learning. So this has been another episode of ReNouned Podcast. We hope that if you want to engage with us a little bit more or do some more research or looking into the show, you can find our show notes certainly attached to whatever platform you are watching or listening on. You can go to renownedpodcast.com to look up a little bit more. We post in our blog a little bit more information around the works cited and some of the sources that we pull our information from. So you can certainly look at that. You can use our noun generator, as I just talked about, brand new addition to that. And you can also find us on social media on Instagram and Facebook. We are at ReNouned Podcast. And that's it. We thank you very much for listening, and we can't wait to talk next time about the American harvest mouse.
It's very exciting. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.